Welcome back to Delta Waterfowl's The Voice of the Duck Hunter podcast. I'm your host, Joel Brice. In today's episode, we're going to read the tea leaves, so to speak, by taking a biologist's approach to forecasting spring duck production, a key factor in the quality of hunting seasons, by analyzing breeding habitat conditions, current weather patterns, last year's breeding population, and more. We'll focus on the prairie pothole region, a key source of continental duck production, while also covering key contributors to the Atlantic and Pacific flyways. It may seem too early to be breaking out our crystal balls, but mid to late March conditions go far towards setting the stage for early nesting in April, peak nesting in May, and late season re-nesting in June. For a second consecutive podcast, I'm joined by two Delta colleagues, this time Mike Buxton and Jim Fisher. As you may recall from our last episode, Mike is a key member of our duck production team. In addition, he produces those exceptional breeding habitat conditions maps you see in the Delta Waterfowl magazine, online, and in social media. He'll share some insights on some of the intel that goes into producing these maps for us duck hunters, plus current wetland conditions he's tracking across Delta's predator management sites and beyond, and what they signal for duck production. Jim Fisher, Delta's VP of Canadian Policy, is a leading voice for ducks, duck hunters, and the conservation of small duck-producing wetlands. He will help us break down those habitat conditions across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, key breeding grounds that can greatly impact duck numbers and hunting season success across the continent. Ready to talk ducks? Let's get started. Jim Fisher, Mike Buxton, welcome to the Delta Waterfowl Podcast.
Thanks, Joel.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. Good to be here.
Yeah, right on. Always weird to be saying welcome to the Delta Waterfowl Podcast from two guys that I've worked with for so long, but welcome. We've got Mike here in the Bismarck office, familiar voice from the last podcast where we were talking about duck production with Matt Chenard. If you missed that episode, give it a listen. That was a good one, talking about our duck production programs. And Jim, you have a long history in our duck production work as well. But Jim Fisher, Jim, what's your title?
I'm the Vice President of Canadian Policy.
That's a big country. That's a lot of work, Jim.
Yeah, we do the best we can with the resources we have. And it's just myself and Brian McRae in Ontario working on policy. So both conservation, like protecting wetlands or conserving wetlands, but also on the hunting side of things as well.
Mike, we're not going to give you an opportunity for another introduction other than Mike is a critical member of our duck production team. He's kind of a twin-headed, I don't want to say a monster because that's not very nice, but a twin-headed weapon as a waterfowl program director and a responsibility very similar to Matt Chenard's. Before we get into the introductions, I'm just going to let everybody just kind of share the subject with everybody. It's March 19th today, 2025, and this time of year, in the office in the duck world, we really talk a lot about breeding conditions, right? Breeding season outlook. And yeah, all of the nesting and the brood rearing that's coming ahead of us, but it's so much reliant on moisture. So this is a great time, for Jim and Mike and I to have this conversation and share it with our members and supporters about how does it look? What do we see today and what are we hoping for and what are some things that we'd like to see change in terms of breeding conditions. But before we get into that one, Jim Fisher, long time, probably the longest standing Delta staff member. Would that be fair, Jim?
Myself and Kevin Ward. Kevin's works up at the marsh at Delta. He's been there for quite a while. I won't peg him down for exactly how many years, but I think for me, I'm over 30 years working for Delta. And then of course, Frank Rower has been bopped in and out of Delta for a long stretch as well. So
yeah, but I think consecutive years of employment, you've got it. You get the award.
Yeah. Next to Kevin. Kevin's, I think he's been pretty much on, although sometimes seasonally. So technically, I guess, Joel, I guess you could say I'm experienced, eh? Yeah.
Very, very good. Jim, let's take a little time. It's been a long time since we had you on the podcast. So this is a great opportunity for our listeners to learn if they're meeting you for the first time or they've known you for that 30 years, can you give us a background, go back to, where you're from, give us a 60-second or 2-minute overview of Jim Fisher and what brought you to where you are today?
Sure. Thanks, Joel. Yeah, I guess growing up I grew up just south of the Delta Marsh, but we had a cottage on Lake Winnipeg and always in a family that loved the outdoors. First came at it from kind of fishing and catching minnows and stuff like that as a little kid. That was my first passion. And then my uncle started taking me, used to come back from Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and drag me out to this collection of shooting camps that's in our family for a long time. But he'd pick me up in his 59 Chevy and drive out to the Delta Marsh to Tin Town and hang out there for 3 or 4 days of eating beans and donuts and paddling out in the darkness and watching for ducks. And even before I was old enough to shoot myself, I just completely fell in love with it and got duck hunting as soon as I could and had my single shot cooey when I was 12. But anyway, it was a real passion, and knew right away when I was a young person that I wanted to work in this field. I thought I was going to work for Ducks Unlimited because I, like a lot of people, that's the first thing you're exposed to. And even though I grew up just south of the marsh, for some reason when I was 12, I thought I wanted to be a DU person and didn't quite get there, but did pretty darn good. Did some summer research at Delta when I was 17 on this marsh ecology research project that was a massive undertaking throughout the 80s, and got my foot in the door there a little bit, and then worked for the province for a few years, and then finished my undergrad in zoology or science and was hoping for a job, and there was virtually no jobs. And so along came an offer from Delta Waterfowl, some good people in the early 90s, and offered me a master's project to work on zero tillage farming and duck nesting in Minnedosa. And then that was, interestingly, the time when we started delving into some new things at Delta. And so we started looking at hen houses, and we had an adopt a pothole program to protect wetlands. And so I would do my field research for my master's in the mornings and then go talk to farmers in the afternoons, and got my foot in the door, I guess, and never left since then. So I've been very fortunate and lived a charmed life working for Delta Waterfowl here in Manitoba.
It's always been waterfowl focused, but a huge chunk of your career, Jim, has been spent focused on private lands, private landowners, and water, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess rightly so. I recognize even when I was in my undergrad, I took some agriculture courses as just out of interest, and realized that that's sort of an important thing. If we like ducks, we better understand and get along well with the farm community. And so I've been lucky enough to pursue that, whether that was adopt a pothole originally, or we worked on the Alice program we started Alice and got it going throughout Canada. So I was working on that throughout the prairies primarily. And then more recently working on basically Alice, but called a different thing. So we have a program called the GROW program, Growing Outcomes in Watersheds, here in Manitoba, which has a big component that protects wetlands. So it rewards and incentivizes producers or farmers to retain their wetlands on the land. And so we've been taking that model. So we have a successful program going in Manitoba. It's been established the last 5 years, and it's going quite well. And we're trying to expand that into Alberta right now, and likely into Saskatchewan at some point in the near future. So yeah, it's been very rewarding getting to work with the farm community, Joel.
It is. I think that's one of the things that I remember when I was early in college in one of my early wildlife classes. They said, I remember the professor, I can't think of his name, they called him Dr. Doom, because he was really a doom and gloom about the future, right? The future of conservation, overpopulation, things like that. But he would say, he goes, all you guys and gals that are out there and, in my class, you got into wildlife thinking that you were going to spend, your job outside holding animals and doing all this kind of stuff. But he goes, but let me give you a kind of a harsh reality here is you're going to spend about 90% of your career dealing with people and 10% of your time dealing with the resource. So I think getting into this field, and all three of us are trained biologists, I think those words have really rung true for me. It's wildlife conservation is a lot about people, whether it's landowners or hunters, or just average people out there on the landscape. It's such a huge part of our job. Do you guys agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's no question, Joel. Yeah, you think you're going to be the fish people have it right. They squeeze fish, and I don't know if we squeeze ducks so much, but we don't handle too many ducks at this point. And in fact, it's a real joy to reconnect with the student program and all our great students that we have, and go and spend time with them, whether that's wherever they're working, mostly on the prairies, and get a chance to go out and look at a duck nest and rekindle those old passions that we had back when we thought we were going to do more of that in our lives. But yeah, it is working with people, and of course that's how we're going to move the needle if we care about the resource, and especially in the case of the farm community, we need to be lockstep with them to ensure the future of the waterfowl resource.
Well said, Jim. Absolutely well said. I think we can get into today's subject. I think that was a great background. I always think it's really important to not just for the listener to hear what we're talking about, but who they're hearing it from. So, I think what you heard there with Jim is somebody who's been involved in waterfowl conservation in Delta for a long, long period of his career. And, and then Mike Buxton, everybody got to learn Mike last episode, and I guess myself. It's been 24 years at Delta, and it's been an absolute joy. Today, though, we're going to talk about breeding conditions, a breeding season outlook. What everybody's going to hear is we're going to be talking almost exclusively about water, right? And so there are two components to I guess, breeding success, or the whole breeding equation, breeding duck equation. There's water and there's grass. Mike, do you want to maybe set up for the listener the role that water and grass play in the whole breeding season equation?
Yeah. So in general, like you said, Joel, there's two components. There's the water and the grass that are important to the breeding season. The water is really what sets the table and is kind of creates the habitat there for the ducks to come back. And so when we look at the landscape and we look at pair densities and stuff like that, we're looking a lot on where the water isn't. Wetland densities play a huge role in a particular area's capacity for breeding ducks. And so when there's a lot of water on the landscape and there's a lot of different wetlands and a lot of different potholes on the landscape in this area I'm talking, that really sets the stage for being able to carry a lot of pairs of breeding ducks, because water and individual ponds is what the nesting pairs come to as far as they establish a territory or along a territory pond. And so the number of ponds on the landscape is really has a big impact as to how many breeding pairs settle in an area. On the other side of things with grass is where for a certain subspecies or subset of ducks, upland nesting ducks, that's really important to the upland nesting ducks, like your blue-winged teal, your gadwall, your shovelers, your pintail, your mallards to a certain extent. Those are all considered upland nesting ducks, as opposed to the diving ducks, which are overwater nests. So it's an overwater nest is just like it sounds. They build a nest out of the cattails and actually nest over water, whereas the upland nesting ducks, they still have their territory pond, which is where the water comes in, but the grass is where they actually make their nest. And so while there's a big difference between the needs between water and grass, they're still both highly needed. And I wanted to also point out that a pair of ducks will be territorial to their pond, within their own species. You might see, a 2-acre pond that's got a pair of mallards, a pair of blooming teal, a pair of shovelers on it. They're not necessarily competitive between species, but you're only going to see, one pair of a species on that pond. When you get into the grass and they start nesting, that territoriality really kind of goes away. And so that's why a lot of ponds on the landscape, to attract as many pairs as possible, is really what sets the table for how productive an area has the potential to be.
So, in one sentence, water, I guess that establishes the breeding potential, the breeding capacity. The grass determines how successful those reproductive efforts are, or the amount of grass can influence it, right? Kind of on a sliding scale. No, it's good. Jim, there's a lot of different wetlands out there, types of wetlands, sizes, shapes. Which types of wetlands, Jim, do we as duck biologists identify as most important, if you had to pick one?
Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky question. Like everything, there's no easy answer. But yeah, we kind of have 5 wetland classes, from kind of shallow ephemeral wetlands all the way up to permanent wetlands that should never go dry, but once in a while they actually do. But so they're just basically depths of wetlands that the glaciers left back when they retreated off this landscape that created all these different wetlands. And so on a 1 square mile of good pothole country, you may have 200 plus potholes or wetlands within that. That shows you the sheer densities of ducks. And the shallow wetlands are super important as far as the carrying capacity that Mike described. So the more they're often smaller in size, and they're more numerous, and so that's really what drives that carrying capacity of the land when the ducks come back in the spring. So they settle based on numbers of wetlands because of that territoriality. So within that 1 square mile, in the best of the best habitat, you might have 100 pairs of ducks settle on that section of land. And so as far as the class goes, and the most important, Joel, if you love canvasback, your answer would be semi-permanent wetlands, the ones with cattail in them and hold water most years throughout the year, and that provides nesting areas for those canvasback. And then of course all the ducks raise their young in, depending on the year, but for sure semi-permanents. And if you're a dabbling duck person, perhaps your answer would be temporary or seasonal wetlands, just because of that seasonality and how much they change over time between wet and dry periods. And when you have those wetlands full, that's when you see the real pulses in the populations.
So those smaller wetlands, Jim, one of the, I think, words to underline is shallow. So what makes those, can you expand on a little bit, those real small, shallow wetlands, what makes them so productive?
Yeah, I guess because they're more numerous, they attract ducks. They, it depends on where we want to take this conversation, but primarily they're most important, especially for temporary wetlands, is that attracting pairs in the spring. So it's mostly about the carrying capacity, and then there is a component that's maybe less important, that ducks, when they first arrive on the breeding ground, so the early ducks that come back, mallards and pintails, even canvasback to some extent, go to these shallower wetlands because the other ones, the deeper ones, are still frozen. So in another week or two, we'll start to see those early migrants coming back. And those shallow wetlands often have a boom of invertebrate food sources, so insects that are living in the water column that provide important protein for ducks, and especially the females that need that protein source to form eggs. And so that's really kind of two big important components of those more shallow wetlands for all ducks, but especially for dabblers, I should say.
Good. Yeah, no, that's excellent. I think the other part here that I think would be good to talk about is when people, I think we talk to duck hunters quite often, and they're like, hey, what's the water conditions? Is it wet up there? So I think there's this general acceptance that wet is better, dry is bad. And specifically, the wetter, probably the more ducks, the more the more productive they may be, either by renesting efforts or like you said, Mike, I think ducks that are attracted to the Dakotas tend to be maybe a bit more productive than they are in Canada. But the other part here is that where does the water come from? So obviously it comes 12 months of the year, but here we are at the end of, I suppose we're technically at the end of winter, not quite spring yet. But there's fall as a time period that people tend to keep track of. Winter, the amount of snow. Snowpack is another key contributor. Mike, can you explain the role of the importance of fall moisture, the importance of winter moisture, or what role they play?
Sure. Well, the fall moisture really gives you a snapshot of what things are going to look like right off the bat when the winter's over and the spring melts. And so if you're in the fall and we have good wetland conditions and it's a wet fall and then it goes into winter from there, you already have the table set pretty well. And I'm not going to say it doesn't matter what happens in the winter, because it does, as far as the amount of snowfall you'd get, but you're less reliant on a really heavy snow year if you have if you go into the winter coming out of a pretty wet fall. The other thing that a really wet winter does is or really wet fall does is it can really help produce a good frost seal, because you have some of that moisture in the system to create a good frost seal. Whereas if you have really dry conditions, it's a little bit more on the porous side. And so getting into the winter, as far as temperature goes and as far as snow goes, it can really have a big impact how much snow you get, yes, but then more importantly is when that snow arrives and the condition of that snow when it arrives. I mean, we've had sometimes in November, we've had 1.5 feet of snow, but if you were to go with the actual water content in the snow, you might only have 1/2 inch, just because it's that really light, fluffy snow that doesn't really provide a whole lot of moisture in it. And then if you fast forward into the spring, when we typically get, the snows that we get in the spring are typically wetter, have more of a moisture content. 1.5 feet of that type of snow typically holds more moisture than that dry snow. But then the temperature in the winter can also play a part. I mentioned the frost seal. The frost seal really kind of holding that water at the top of the water table going into the winter and spring. And so if you have a really good frost seal, when all that snow melts, it can kind of sit right on top of sit right on top of the land and sit on top of the frost seal and produce those small temporary and seasonal wetlands like Jim was talking about. Whereas if you've had a warmer winter, doesn't have a lot of snow, doesn't get a really good frost seal, as soon as any snow that you have melts, it gets sucked right into the ground. And so you'll see kind of a wide array over the past, I'll say 10 years. And some years we've had really good frost seal and really good snowfall that has allowed those smaller depressions like Jim talked about to fill up in the spring. But then you have other years where we've gotten little to no snow, or we've gotten a lot of snow, but we got it early on and we never really got a chance to get that good frost seal. And so some of that water just goes straight into the ground. And it also depends on how wet or dry you were going into the winter, as far as where that water table is in relation to the surface.
Good explanation. One of the things that was kind of interesting, the type of snow, if you're gonna try to equate a certain depth of snowfall to an equivalent in rain, it certainly depends, on the moisture content of the snow. But one of the things that I read was that, and I think it's a decent rule of thumb, but there's a lot of wiggle room on both sides, is that 10 inches of snow equals an inch of rain, right? And that's I call that hand grenade close. Yeah, certainly there's snow that holds a lot more moisture content than that, and and others that hold less. But so I think when the listener, like, we're hoping for all kinds of snow up in the breeding grounds, and first of all, I say, hey, we live here, right? So let's hold back on the snow. Let's get those spring rains instead of a ton of snow. But that's kind of an indication. I mean, you could literally have 30 inches of snow might equal 3 inches of rain. Living here, I'd rather have the 3 inches of rain. I'm not sure about you guys. Than neck deep in snow and shoveling all winter long. But I guess then we signed up to live here, so it's self-inflicted pain if we don't like it. But
hey, Joel, I think what Mike's saying is there's lots of ways we can end up with premium wetland conditions in the spring. And yes, we live here, but we'll gladly suffer through a lot of shoveling if we can have those premium wetland conditions come spring, being the duck nuts that we are. So
I suppose. But if you could guarantee me personally, if you could guarantee me a really wet spring, I'd take that. Maybe 2 feet of snow, because I do love the winter and I do like winter sports for sure. But we've had those 120-inch winters. That's long. That's long. It does make you want to take a trip. I don't care who you are. Here we are, third week of March. Jim, where does the moisture come from this point forward? What are, kind of in big bucket, broad bucket terms, what type of moisture is ahead of us that will contribute to a good breeding effort?
Yeah, it's a great question because midwinter often very dry. When it's really cold, often, if it's Fahrenheit, it's 20 below, or once we get to 40, it crosses, between Celsius and Fahrenheit. But anyway, we don't get much moisture in the middle of winter, so it's either, as Mike described, kind of those fall rains, and going into the winter with lots of moisture, or it's a spring moisture. So often we get these big systems, the Colorado lows coming through, and they're dropping a foot of heavy wet snow, and often on the other side of the front there's rain. So it's often a combination of both. You get great driving conditions with freezing rain, and followed by a big dump of snow and high winds. It's just wonderful. But that's what you're hoping for, and we certainly have seen a lot of those over time, and that's what we're hoping for. And then if that doesn't happen, then you're looking more at the kind of mid to late April. You're hoping for rain, and into May, because the ducks are arriving kind of early to say anywhere throughout April, I guess, throughout the pothole region, depending how far north or south you are. And then the nesting really starts in earnest kind of that last week of April for the early ones, and into early May for pretty much everybody. So that's the start of it for the majority of the species. So any rain you get prior to that, and then, I don't know if you want to keep going, Joel, but often we even get rains while the nesting season happens. And then there's always this debate of, do you want that moisture? Because then you might start to flood out nests that are, close to the water or over water. So
that is something for sure. Yeah. And then you don't want it to dry up, because then there's broods out on the landscape that might not have, hens that might not have brood rearing habitat within a reasonable distance of her nest site. Mike did a great job of sharing with us that lots of potholes that are full of water, that sets the table for a strong local breeding population. But Jim, wet and dry years also they have a dramatic influence on the intensity of the breeding effort. Can you describe, what on a drought year versus a very wet year, describe the differing intensities of nesting and breeding efforts?
Yeah, more complicated stuff.
That's why we threw it to you, Jim.
The ducks, yeah, thanks. The ducks definitely, when they're coming, there's kind of two groups of ducks. One are what we call pioneering species, so that'd be pintail and blue wings, especially blue wings that are kind of following, they're migrating north, and if they find a good wet area with not a lot of competition as far as territoriality goes, they'll stop. And so they'll stop well south of the traditional PPR that we always talk about, but also keep coming and fill those areas. And then there's ducks that have more of a homing instinct. So canvasback and mallard are great examples of those ducks, where the the female ducklings that hatch in that area, they drive the bus, like just like us people, eh? And so the female ducks choose their mates, and then they go back home to where, within a very small distance of where they hatched as ducklings. And so you have the settling based on those couple of factors. So if you have like we're going to talk about later on, we have a variety of habitat conditions or wetland conditions across the PPR, and those wetter areas will not surprisingly have more ducks showing up on them. And so if you get an area that has a lot of wetland basins and a lot of water, that's where you see that 60 to 100 pairs of all ducks settling on that per section of land.
Jim, maybe expand on this one a little bit too. So ducks lose their nests to predators or other reasons, most commonly predators. On a dry year versus a wet year, can you kind of describe that re-nesting intensity or propensity?
Yeah, it's lots of factors go into nesting effort by ducks, and again, if it's wet or early spring, oftentimes the early nesters, if they're successful, have a higher clutch size, and they're more productive. But yeah, if conditions if it becomes super dry, the ducks will shut off their reproduction. If it remains wet, we know that mallards will re-nest many times. Other ducks not so much, but mallards are extremely prolific. So I think there's documented cases of 7 or 8 nesting attempts from a single hen. And so yeah, if the conditions are extremely wet throughout the breeding season, or if we get those later rains, that will encourage ducks to stick around and to keep trying. And so, for example, we talked about mallards starting nests in April. On a wet year, they'll initiate a new nest through to the middle of July. So that's a big window in which they can, just keep trying and trying to have that hatch and pass on their genes. So
perfect. That's a good explanation. It's I heard somebody say the other day, I saw it in a book. So I think kind of similar to that, Jim, you did a nice job there. You do a really nice job describing things in a way that it creates pictures in my mind, and hopefully it's doing the same thing for the listener. So we're going to move on here to get actually into the water conditions or breeding season outlook as our murky crystal ball here in the third week of March. I think we're going to start in the prairie pothole region. And so just to prop up the prairie pothole region, we're talking about North Dakota, South Dakota, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And one of the things that we share is that, of the ducks harvested in North America, between upwards of 50 to 70% of those ducks were sourced in the prairie pothole region. So, of course, there's duck and goose species that don't breed inside the PPR. But if we're talking about lumping it into one big pile of ducks out there on the landscape, 50 to 70% of the continental duck harvest comes out of that region. So I think what we're going to start in, we'll go North and South Dakota, and then Jim, we're going to jump up to you in Manitoba, and you can take us across Saskatchewan into Alberta. Then we'll end up in the Pacific Northwest, and then we'll end up into the Northern Atlantic Flyway region to give some outlooks here. So starting real close here to the Bismarck office, Mike, why don't you give the listener just kind of an overview of current water conditions in both Dakotas?
Yeah, so to really set the table for what the water conditions are looking like now, I think it's also important to look back not on just the last 6 months, but actually the last year, just to give the listener an idea of where we've been. So, but this time last year, we were here in the Dakotas. We were a little on the drier side, for sure. But then I want to say probably early May, late April, early May, we just started getting rain after rain after rain. And it's the kind of rain that duck biologists and duck hunters should dream of for the prairies, just because it seemed like the faucet never turned off for about 2 months there, about 2.5 months actually, through the middle of July. We were getting inches of rain every week, and it really filled up those ponds, and breeding conditions looked phenomenal. coming out from May through June and into July. Well, then July hit about mid-July, like I said, and that faucet just completely shut off. We got very little, if any, moisture the remainder of the summer, and it was also a very dry fall. We didn't get hardly any precipitation throughout the fall, and so we had pretty good conditions, but those conditions are really dependent on not constant rain, but enough rain and enough precipitation to keep them at their current level. And we just didn't get that for the second half of the summer and then through the fall. So we went into winter, on the drier side, there were ponds that definitely had water in them. And I wouldn't say that they were mud rings going around the edge of the water by any means, but they were, it had definitely dropped in the last couple of months. In late August, I drove to South Dakota to pick up a Labrador puppy, and you could see where the water had been that spring and had since dried. So it was apparent that things had dried up quite a bit. So when going into the winter, we were really hoping for kind of a big snow year to get us back to that level that we were at before the faucet turned off. And unfortunately, we just in the eastern Dakotas, in many areas, we didn't really get that much snow this year. We had a lot of areas of South Dakota that got about half to 3/4 of their average precipitation. We did have some areas in North Dakota, specifically up in that northeastern area in the Devil's Lake region that got some decent snow, but for the most part, the eastern Dakotas just didn't really have much snow. And I think we've been snow free for several weeks now here in the Bismarck area anyways. And talking to a bunch of our trappers that are out there on the landscape doing our predator management work right now, they've told me that, there's some water in the ponds, especially up in that Devil's Lake region. There's water there, but, we need some spring rain in the next month and a half if we're going to keep that water where it is or fill the dry ponds back up again. So in a nutshell, I'd say, the right now, a snapshot in time right now, the eastern Dakotas, there's some bright spots, but, there's also some fairly dry spots as well. We've also gotten a lot of big windstorms come through here, which has dried things out a little bit more. And so I'd say in the eastern Dakotas, we're definitely on the side of things where we're hoping for some moisture here in the next month and a half to really get things back to where they need to be.
So a little game of catch up is what we're hoping to play.
Yeah, that's right. And last year it kind of, we talked about duck settling patterns a little bit earlier. Is last year, we had, like I said, great conditions when May hit. But prior to us getting a bunch of rain, we were on the drier side. And so that happened to be when a bunch of the ducks were coming through. And so the conditions turned out to be great for the ducks that settled here, but we had far fewer ducks settle here than we have in the past. And I think a big part of that had to do with, just the lower breeding population, but then also, when you have dry conditions like that, ducks are they're gonna settle where there's the resources that they need in order to make nests. And so if it's not going to be in the Dakotas, they're just going to keep right on going, especially for those species like blue-winged teal that are really not tied to a certain area, that are more tied to where the good water is.
Thanks, Mike. Jim, do you have a better, more positive outlook for us? Maybe start in Manitoba and head west?
Yeah, boy, not really as a quick answer to that, Joel. Starting in Manitoba, the southwest corner, mostly in Manitoba, we're talking about a relatively small piece of Manitoba, the southwest corner. And I'm going to split it into two areas, like across most of the three prairie provinces. There's kind of a prairie landscape and a parkland. And the parkland is further north and deeper wetlands and more trees associated with that versus southern, more traditional grasslands. And I think just broadly speaking, the south is not great and the parkland is somewhat better for the three lumped together, but I'll go through each. Manitoba, around Minnedosa Shoal Lakes, they have good snowpack. Things are looking quite good there. It's kind of been a steady source of good water conditions over the past several years. So that's kind of one bright spot in Prairie Canada. But further south, you get around Whitewater Lake, south of Brandon, and it's definitely drier there. And then jumping across to Saskatchewan, that wet stuff in the parklands extends up kind of through Yorkton on your way to Saskatoon. Good amounts of snow. Having said that, it has been dry. You talk about how we go into these situations. So optimistic there as far as good amounts of snow, but certainly concerns because it's been so dry heading into this winter that depending on how the snow melt happens, something we didn't talk about, but if it's a slow kind of hovering around the freezing mark and back and forth, that snow just kind of disappears versus a quick intense warm up where it might reach 10 degrees Celsius or 50 Fahrenheit. You get a much quicker runoff and that's kind of what we're hoping for. And so Saskatchewan, I would say the parkland region of Saskatchewan, that's, if you're a farmer, maybe you don't really want this, but you want the land, the water to soak into the soils of their crop fields. So we might run sort of counter to their desires but for our ducks, yeah, we want the water to go a little bit faster and fill the wetlands up. And then in southern Saskatchewan, just kind of an ongoing drought there. And then similarly in Alberta, really patchy. I think we'll see that from our map of wetland conditions as well. Really good up north, the Peace River country, around Edmonton, Parkland region, kind of an average amount of snow there. And then you get south of Edmonton around Red Deer and conditions really quickly deteriorate. And there's been a lot of concern and discussion around drought. And I'm afraid that really hasn't changed. So there's a lot of brown earth there right now. So no snow there. And, there's several wetlands, even the semi-permanent ones that we talked about that have been bone dry for the last 2 or 3 years. And so we're really concerned with southern Alberta for the most part. Yeah.
So if we were to summarize just kind of what we said there into kind of broad statements, the Eastern Dakotas, Mike, what would your big bucket?
I'd say the Eastern Dakotas for the immediate future, with once whatever snow and ice melts, there should be some water on the landscape, but it may go kind of quick. So our hope is to have some spring moisture come through to really prop up and fill those basins back up again.
Okay, and then Jim, sounds like Parkland, Manitoba, Parkland, Saskatchewan, reasonably bright outlook. There's potential there. We have to realize that
That's
potential. Right. And then in the prairies of Saskatchewan, not the case. Probably some concerns there. Real concerns in Alberta, right? So I think at this point of the year, if we're cheerleaders and we're rooting on, we need moisture from here on out in all these areas. Doesn't sound like any area of the PPR is set right now for a great breeding effort.
I'd agree with that, and I'd say that in the Dakotas for the past 5 or 6 years, we've had certainly a couple of years of severe drought, like in the 2021 time frame. That was definitely some severe drought for us in the Dakotas. But then, up in Saskatchewan, kind of what Jim was alluding to with have a lot of snow, but then, what's the deficit that you're working with? Jim, you would know better than I would, but I'd say we've been kind of on a downward decline in moisture in Saskatchewan since probably the mid 2010s. There hasn't, I remember the summer I spent up near Saskatoon in 2014, and that year was probably one of the wettest years that we've had on record there. And I think ever since then, from what I've heard, it's kind of little by little it's been going downhill, and as far as drying up anyways. And it I think it's important for folks to understand that when you get to levels of dryness that severe, it doesn't all go away with a 5-inch rain. It takes a significant amount of moisture to bring all that back. And I think, the last few winters have been better as far as starting to kind of get out of that red zone. But they were pretty far into it, and so it takes a lot of moisture, and it sometimes can take a couple of years to completely bring an area out of really dry conditions.
Jim, we talked before getting on the podcast that we'd like to share with the listener that lives in the outer flyways, right? A lot of the conversation that we just had here was talking about the center of the continent, and of course the PPR is a contributor to duck harvest all over, the U.S. and Canada, from the East Coast to the West Coast. But we'd like to spend maybe just a little bit of time giving the Atlantic Flyway listener, a glimpse at Northern Atlantic Flyway, breeding conditions, or how they, what the outlook is as of today, and then spend, a similar amount of time talking about the Pacific Flyway. Jim, can you give us kind of have you been able to do any research, or people that you talk to or work with? Give us a little bit of an outlook for the headwaters of the Atlantic Flyway.
Yeah, we don't study it as much, but it's certainly real important for Atlantic Flyway folks, and all around the Great Lakes are really what contribute a big chunk of what a South Carolina duck hunter might experience. But yeah, Ontario is quite wet. They've had some good snowfalls. They had one a couple of weeks back, a real heavy snow event came through, kind of an extensive region of southern Ontario, well into Quebec. And of course, all these storms end up going through Newfoundland. We could talk about the rock here in a minute too, but yeah, and right now they're experiencing, they had another big dump of rain, a big thunderstorm, and higher temperatures all at once. So all the snow, that couple feet of snow on the ground, kind of is melting at a rapid pace with a big dump of rain and thunderstorms. So there's been a real runoff event, and people's houses flooding, and so lots of kind of, like all this stuff, there's pros and cons to it. So, but just second to our concern here about ducks, it's going to be good conditions throughout southern Ontario and into central and northern Ontario and well into Quebec as well. So that's good news. And then you look over to the three maritime provinces are also quite wet. They went into the winter wet, and you're more of a moderate. You don't get the mood swings like we get on the prairies with droughts and floods anywhere near the same. It's just a wet climate, obviously, in the Maritimes. Imagine that term. But so anyway, so things are looking good for the three maritime provinces, and then over in Newfoundland, they have lots of moisture there as well. Like I mentioned, pretty much every storm that's swept across North America this winter ends up in Newfoundland, and so it's going to be a good year out for the East Coast.
Perfect. Mike, you're originally from Vermont. I think you said you reached out to a friend of yours in Vermont to get some of the...
I actually reached out to the Vermont State waterfowl biologist, Andrew Bowden, just to get a sense from him of kind of what things are looking like down in his neck of the woods. And the northeastern U.S., a little bit different story than the eastern Canada as far as the amount of moisture that they've had. The New England states, some of the northern parts of it have been okay as far as moisture goes, but they've been dry. They were kind of dry going into the winter, and so they had about average to a little bit maybe below average snow this year, and so the runoff is there, but how long that runoff will last kind of remains to be seen until it soaks in. Areas of upstate New York, aside from Western New York, look pretty decent, but then you get down into the Pennsylvania, New Jersey area, and they're dealing with some drought conditions there, and they had less snow than they typically do on a given year, and so looking like kind of a mixed bag on the northeastern U.S. As far as the Atlantic Flyway on the eastern seaboard goes, but overall, talking to the Vermont biologist, he mentioned that they've got some of those standing temporary and seasonal ponds right now, and they're hoping that those last until the pairs come and settle. But that's a situation where those temporary and seasonal ponds, again, depending on the water table level, they can be there one day and completely gone the next. It's actually quite amazing how fast those temporary and seasonal wetlands can dry up if the frost seal goes and the water table is low. You can see a lot of ponds one day, and then the next day they're all gone. So hoping that a lot of those ponds stick around and they get some additional moisture just to keep them full.
Perfect. Thank you, Mike. Mike, skipping over to the Pacific Flyway, give us a quick overview. Kind of, it's a big chunk of ground. We're talking Alaska down into California. Can you give us a brief overview of what you've discovered in that part of the world?
Yeah, so starting at the top in Alaska, Alaska is a pretty important area, especially for the Pacific Flyway, as far as pintails and other ducks that come from up there, and geese as well. And so I reached out to a biologist up in Alaska, and she obviously told me that Alaska is a big state, and so there's kind of a varying conditions across the state. But she let me know that the south half of Alaska has had record low precipitation and record breaking warm from a winter standpoint. So the snow and ice breakup might be a little bit earlier this year than is typical. But if you go to the north half of the state, things look about normal from a condition standpoint up there. So that's good news for the birds that breed up there. And then coming south into the Pacific coast, it's kind of a different system than we're used to dealing with here. Here in the prairies, everything is driven by what happens here on the prairies. Like if you have a square mile of land, for the most part, the amount of water that you're going to have on that land depends on how much precipitation falls on that land. You might have some influx coming from outside, but those western states, it's a little bit different of a system in that they do have precipitation, obviously, that hits them in like the Sac Valley of California and the Central Valley. But a lot of their water comes from snowmelt in the mountains. And so it really depends on what's going on in the mountains as to how their water is going to look. So in a sense, much like a lot of southern duck hunters look to the north for their ducks, California water looks to the north for a lot of their water as well. And from what I've been hearing, there's some pretty good snowpack up in the mountains. So hopefully, right now California doesn't look phenomenal from a dryness perspective, especially Southern California. But hopefully, with all that snow melt coming down out of the mountains, conditions will improve.
Here's hoping, right?
Yep.
I think. Thanks, guys. That was a great overview. Very mixed bag. I remember it feels like the first half of my career, it was more normal for the breeding grounds to be wet border to border. And wow, production was through the roof. But it seems like the narrative over maybe the last decade, it feels like, is it's typically wet somewhere in the prairies, in the PPR, and dry somewhere. So you end up with average to an above average potential. But in some years, it's popping up border to border, average to dry conditions. And so I think it's important, kind of just a really quick glimpse, about breeding season to fall flight. The breeding pair surveys that are conducted in the spring, those are counting adult ducks, right? And the amount of water and a bunch of other factors will predict how productive they're going to be. We talked about that one. But it's, again, I think it's really important to point out the ducks that are going to be counted, in the months ahead, those are adult ducks. That's not your fall flight. One of our colleagues here at Delta says you don't shoot the breeding population, you shoot the fall flight. So this is exactly what we're talking about here. We're talking about the water and what type of a breeding effort, breeding success we could be hoping for. Generally speaking, wetter equals more ducks, drier equals fewer ducks when you're getting into the fall. So we're going to jump into that in future episodes when we get into the heart of the breeding season and some of the big surveys. When they come out, we'll jump back on and we'll have a conversation about more of an updated look and glimpse, and we'll have with a lot more confidence. But for now, you've heard that the conditions are average to below average over the entirety of at least the center of the continent, but your outer flyways have bright spots, right? Particularly in the Atlantic flyway. I think we're going to restrict the rest of the conversation here to water conditions. And I think, because we've been on here for a good amount of time here, but Mike, you've been developing once a month, right? I believe we push out a map that is intended to give the viewer just kind of an indication of water conditions. Can you give a little overview, Mike, about what that is?
Yeah, so it's the Delta Waterfowl breeding habitat conditions map. And basically the goal of this map is to give a general picture of what breeding conditions are looking like in many of the key breeding areas of North America. And I'll say we think it's pretty good, but it's not 100% perfect. There's here in the prairies you can vary. 5 miles away can be 3 inches of rain, and here can be nothing. And so there's a lot of variation going on there. And so this map kind of smooths things out and gives it more of a general sense. But it really kind of gives us a snapshot on a monthly basis as to kind of how things are looking, because Delta Waterfowl is a relatively small organization in comparison, and we don't have a biologist in every single town in all of North America, and so we can't get in-field reports from every square inch of the breeding grounds of North America. So we use a lot of different data to compile this map. A lot of it has to do with precipitation, but a lot of it has to do with kind of what's already there from a groundwater perspective, and what's already on the landscape. Because you can have and Saskatchewan is a perfect example of this, is you can have an area that it's pretty severe drought, and then all of a sudden they get a gully washer that's 5 inches of rain. And if you just look at a precipitation map for the last month, you're going to be like, wow, Saskatchewan's super wet. This is going to be awesome. When in reality, 4 3/4 inches of that went straight into the ground, just because it's so dry. And then that last 1/4 inch is going to be gone the next day, just because that water table needs to kind of refresh itself. And so the data that we use to compile all of this really looks at a wide array of different things, and it's not going to show changes, very dramatic changes. It's more of the gradual increase, gradual decrease, because in reality, that's what happens on the landscape. You might have some rain events that come through and completely change the landscape for a matter of a couple of days. But then once that water subsides, you kind of get back to the everyday normal. And likewise, if you don't get any rain for a month, but conditions were already pretty good, then you're not automatically going into a drought. So those are the types of things that we focus on with the map, and the goal of it is just to kind of give our members a snapshot of here's in general what things are looking like.
Good. Yeah, and Mike, you generate those once a month. They go out on social media. I believe they're on our website as well.
Yep.
And they go into, one of those maps goes into each of the 5 issues of our magazine.
Yep.
So it's quite easy to pay attention to, and I've really grown to like them. It's a good product. I love the analogies. It's super dry, got a bunch of rain, soaks in the ground. That's quite deceiving from a distance. So just by casually paying attention to this map, you get an indication of what does it mean for ducks. And that's what it matters, right? That's what this conversation is all about. Jim, have you paid attention to the maps for your part of the world?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, they're a great resource and give a snapshot. And like Mike's alluding to, it changes, it pulses depending on the weather. Stick around for, what's the saying? Stick around for an hour or whatever it is, and weather will change. So yeah, but yeah, it's a good resource, and it keeps our members apprised as to what the conditions are like and what they might expect come fall, and a little bit of an indication anyway. Obviously, it's certainly a heck of a lot better than nothing and just hearsay.
I think in a little, well, I guess it was maybe a month ago, our social media folks actually put together a time lapse of, I think it was last May through current days, and it just went month by month video just to show how conditions had changed. And like I said, this map is more going to pick up on gradual changes, and so you're not seeing it going from blue to red in one fell swoop, but you're seeing over time you see the dry areas get a little bit bigger, dry areas get a little bit smaller, and so it's a good resource for just kind of seeing seasonal changes in the conditions across the board.
Yeah, if you're listening to this and you haven't seen one of these before, picture a map of the North American continent and shaded in different colors, different gradients. And so, Mike, isn't it more like a red-brown, like a deep orangish red? You end up in more of that droughty, and then kind of a deep navy. Let's say, is that the right color? That'd be the other extreme. And so the continent is shaded to some degree based on those colors. And if you looked at the breeding conditions map that we have most recently published, I bet you it mimics this conversation that we've had today. I don't have the copy in front of me. Mike, do you?
Yeah, and the most recent one is current as of the end of February. So we have had, anytime you add another, especially around here anyways, another 20 days without any precipitation to speak of, things just degrade a little bit further. So so for the most part it tracks pretty good, but this conversation is happening 3 weeks after the data was collected, and so even as gradual as a change as it usually picks up, when you're not seeing additional moisture come into the system, once you start that downhill slide and not getting rain, it can things can dry up quite a bit faster.
For those that like to do research and like to be involved, Mike, what are some other? I mean, I think go to the map that you've developed, and that's I don't think you need to go much farther. But there's other precipitation types of maps. What are some other sources of information that people can check into from time to time if they're interested?
So both the U.S. and Canadian drought monitor maps are usually are really good sources. They do a great job of seeing what areas are in short-term droughts, long-term droughts, stuff like that. And then the down here in the U.S., NOAA has their whole job is to track the weather and to track that kind of stuff. And so they've got literally thousands of different layers that you can look at to see precipitation amounts, how that precipitation stacks up against what's usually there, look at different time periods. And so you can spend a lot of time monkeying around on those weather maps and trying to kind of put together a full picture.
Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate that. Appreciate what you do for us and for the listener, and sharing the conditions and bringing the breeding grounds a little bit closer. I think in wrapping this up, in the last episode, I asked Mike what his favorite duck was to hunt, and then I asked Matt the same question. Jim, you're the Delta famous diver hunter, but what is your favorite duck species to hunt?
Yeah, back when I was younger, I would have answered pintail, but honestly, growing up on the Delta Marsh, and especially back in the day, the bluebills were the best duck going. And if you like paddling out you have to use man-powered stuff and going out into whitecaps sometimes and hunting off points and seeing those big flocks of bluebills coming racing in. It gets my heart going, and that's my big passion. And it was had some good shoots this past fall at Delta. So some excellent work has been done by some of our colleagues on the marsh, and it's been improving over the last decade or so. And so we have a lot of people to thank for that. But that's my favorite duck. Great on the table. I know the people in Mississippi will be shaking their heads right now because they eat a lot of minnows and things down further south, but I've yet to dabble in that regard. But certainly up here, they're eating little shrimp, and they're very good table fare and great gunning challenge for us as shotgunners.
You bet. I think on the last podcast, I think I shared that I really enjoyed shooting shovelers, particularly in the early part of my time here in the prairies. So I think I'll get more ribbing than you do, because a good bluebill hunt is hard to beat. Well, guys, thank you very much for your time and the resources that you've shared with people. And it's tough to synthesize a continent, continental water conditions. But I think you both did a great job, and we thank you for your time.
Thanks, Joel.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
Thanks a lot.
We may check back in April or May and give everybody another look at how things are going.
Sounds good.
Sounds great.
All right. Take care, guys.
Thanks.